It's a thrill to be here. While SVA is, unfortunately, I cannot claim as part of my own lineage. This book very much owes a lot to people from the extended SVA and design writing family. As Molly mentioned, Alan Rapp, who was the editor of this book and really shepherded it into being, is a graduate of an incarnation of this program. And I hear operations here are directed by Eric, who was a really brilliant research assistant on this book. So it does feel like coming home, even though it's a home I never lived in before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, Citymakers, how it came to be, what some of these words mean, and then hopefully in conversation we can kind of test what the resonances are between this and some of the urban theory in which it's in dialogue, including that of Lewis Mumford. Although Lewis Mumford is not somebody I sort of deal with explicitly in this book, I think there's no such thing as an American urbanist who is not in some way in dialogue with Mr. Mumford's thoughts. I wrote my master's thesis in part on a movie Lewis Mumford made in 1939. So I've got lots to say about Lewis Mumford. It doesn't necessarily come through in the book, but I think that we can have an interesting conversation about what it means in terms of the contemporary practices from New York City that I'm going to talk about, which are the sort of main spine of the book, but the ways in which those are contextualized and characterized by a whole sort of forest of literature in urban theory and urbanism. And urbanism, I think, is a really interesting sort of point of departure. You know, when we think of urbanism, Lewis Mumford is certainly one of the sort of canonical figures who I guess you could say made a case for urbanism as something that could be studied, could be an object of serious study. He was, of course, coming after 50 years of urbanism in sociology, primarily in sort of Northern European sociology with Weber and Durkheim and then Simmel. But as far as for a general readership, I think if anyone knew the word urbanism or thought the cities were worthy of study, for many people in this country, it would have come from Mumford. But for me, a city maker is an important, there's an important distinction between city maker and urbanist. I myself consider myself to be an urbanist. If you meet me at a cocktail party and ask me what I do, I will say I'm an urbanist, and then I will expect somewhat of a blank stare. Is that a job? Like, what does that mean? What is, you can do that? To which I often reply that an urbanist, to my mind, is someone who studies urban dynamics. And what that implies, and is certainly true in my case, is somebody who looks at cities and urban phenomena from a little bit of an academic remove, and maybe represents through writing or scholarship, or in my case also through the making of films and other forms of media, urban dynamics and tell stories about cities. In this book, I was really interested in kind of claiming a space for a more active and practical definition of the kinds of practices that I wanted to write about and lift up and kind of draw a line around. And so for me, city maker, which is somewhat of an invented word, characterizes this not necessarily a new type of practice, but the new types of coalitions that I observed through my work at Urban Omnibus emerging and really becoming something that I saw fit to try and codify as an identity that brings together a lot of things that otherwise might be considered to be distinct areas of focus. So what is a city maker? I think oftentimes when we think about city making, we're thinking about environments, to the extent that we do think about city making, we're thinking about environments like this. Right? This is Brooklyn Bridge Park, designed by Michael Van Valkenburg, landscape architects. It's a really beautiful and highly successful public space in many ways. I write about it quite favorably in the book, but it's by no means the extent of what I'm talking about. This kind of sort of completed environment that is delivered, and as you can see in this image, is very much oriented towards a particular kind of consumption of an urban scene, and it's kind of, you can cut a ribbon on it, it's done, is an important part of city making, but it's by no means the extent of it. Similarly with this is the 34th Street Ferry Terminal, designed by Kennedy Violich Architects, which I write about again quite favorably as an example of a sort of multitasking infrastructure, which is the subject of one of the chapters in the book. But this kind of architectural project is again an important aspect of city making, but by no means the extent of it. When I'm talking about city making, I am including landscape practices and architectural practices, but I'm also including the people who actively build the city, the public servants, as well as the people out there implementing those plans. I'm also talking about informal and voluntary forms of designing, designating, maintaining, and stewarding public space. This is an example from Corona Plaza in Queens that I write about in great length in the public space chapter, and I'll come back to a little bit in a moment. I'm also talking about this kind of stewardship, right? These are people who are just spending a little bit of their leisure time, their time where they're not working, in the case of the image on the left, watering beds of street flowers in Gowanus, near to where I was living when I wrote this book. On the right, we have Beverly, who farms in a formerly vacant lot in East New York. And these kinds of space creation and public space stewardship, I think, are incredibly important to bring into a conversation that also includes those more formal exercises in city making, the architects, the planners, the elected officials. And it also includes, and I think this is in many ways one of the key contributions that I hope this book makes in attempting to sort of define this new identity, if you will, of people who are actively sort of thinking about how to make cities a little bit more just, a little bit more resilient, a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more stimulating, the public servants. I love this image. Most of the images in the book are taken by a brilliant photographer to whom Alan introduced me, Alex Fradkin. And this image, I think, really sort of exemplifies what I love so much about his photography. Because this is an office building downtown that happens to have some municipal agencies in it, as well as a lot of private sector clients. But in the reflection, I think this image really sort of encapsulates something that I see as a big challenge in how we talk about cities. We tend to think about public services and public servants and public service delivery only when something breaks, right? And so reflected in the glass, you have some people attending to a broken water main. But what's happening on the other side of the building, oftentimes in very uninspiring offices, is, I think, equally worthy of celebrating and interrogating and lifting up. I was really, really eager to bring into dialogue with the designers and the power brokers and the people who volunteer their time to take care of aspects of the city, to bring those into dialogue with the public servants for whom their job is to think in many ways, quite visionary ways, over long periods of time on projects that never necessarily have a ribbon to cut on them as a complete environment. So I really wanted to lift up public service and the people who dedicate their professional lives to public service delivery in the built environment, in dialogue with the designers, the architects, and the people who decide things. And part of the reason to do this is for me to get beyond this very tired binary and dichotomy that we have in American urbanism between exclusively top-down approaches to city making and exclusively bottom-up approaches to city making, which in this country and in this city is often aligned with Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. And for me, while there are both of these are incredibly important people who I think one should continue to study, but they are, I think, too often reified into pretty simplistic categories that really deny agency to a broad swath of the kinds of practices and the kinds of individuals whose voices and perspectives I wanted to lift up with this work. We tend to characterize the top-down or the Robert Moses meat-axe approach as, there's this nefarious cabal of undemocratic experts who are creating, huge mega projects that are completely insensitive to local impacts. And on the other hand, we tend to think of the bottom and bottom up as this undifferentiated and rather nostalgic mass of community that is oftentimes characterized as completely resistant to large-scale change, in ways that while we can never sort of deny or forget the power of these groundswells of bottom-up community activism, I think it's incumbent upon those of us who tell these stories to do so in a way that really recognizes the individual capacities and capabilities of leaders of these movements, not just to sort of think of community as this big sort of blob of, people without a voice who only as a collective can have a voice. A little bit of the origin story of all of this work, it comes from, as Molly mentioned in the introduction, I was the founding editor of an online magazine called Urban Omnibus, published by the Architectural League of New York. It doesn't look like this anymore. This is a legacy image. It's gone through a beautiful redesign and sort of reorientation, but this is what it looked like when I was running it. And Urban Omnibus comes out of a very long legacy at the Architectural League of New York, over 130 years of legacy. The league was started way back in 1881 as a club for the purposes of architectural study. It was this was at a time in this country where there were very few, almost no options for the professional study of architecture in this country. There was, of course, a major sort of apprenticeship and craftsman tradition in American architecture, but if you really wanted to study architecture, you had to go to France. And so a lot of the existing designers in this city wanted to come up with a way to create essentially a mutual education society to continue their architectural study beyond the apprenticeship phase. So they got together and formed a club where they would give each other sketch problems and then invite grand masters of the tradition to come and critique their results. And through this created this network which survives to this day and still sort of has at its core this mission of mutual education, of creating a community of designers, celebrating individual work and excellence within design traditions, but then also the most important part, which often gets overlooked, is then applying the collective expertise of that community of designers towards issues of public concern in the city where it's located in New York. And that work has intensified, particularly over the last 30 years, in really landmark studies such as Vacant Lots or New Schools for New York or Envisioning East New York, which were, Vacant Lots was looking at options for scattered site infill affordable housing development at a time when that was considered completely unfeasible. Same thing with New Schools. This was at a time when the Schools Construction Authority was positing that to make a school economically viable, it had to be the size of a full city block. So the Public Education Association and the League got together to say, wait, let's actually ask some architects if we can create alternative prototypes that might push back against that conventional wisdom. And Urban Omnibus very much comes out of this legacy of what do you do, what is possible when you bring conversations between different sectors of people focusing on questions of public concern and social justice in the city into a common conversation. 2008 is when the idea first launched, and if you can think back almost, 10 years ago, it was a very different world for many different reasons. This was a time at which, the iPhone was less than a year old and was by no means, market saturated. It's hard to imagine that. But smartphones were very new. Newspapers were completely in crisis. There was at the time that the Urban Omnibus was originally conceived, we were still sort of at the tail end of the building boom. We had no idea what was going to happen in September. And we were still being told by Washington that credit markets were healthy and that everyone's housing would continue to add value upon value forever and ever. Of course, things didn't work out quite that way. And one of the things that sort of led Rosalie Ginevro, the executive director of the League, to come up with this idea was really just came from her noticing the amount of innovation that was happening in various different sectors and in various different neighborhoods across New York City that wasn't quite managing to bubble up into one sort of common or shared conversation. So you had sort of, landscape architects talking to landscape architects, community people in Brownsville talking to community people in Brownsville, and you had a tremendous range of attention and innovation and excitement and enthusiasm about cities and neighborhoods, but without an appropriate forum for those kinds of knowledge to cross lines of neighborhood, to cross geographic, to cross disciplinary lines. Everything was kind of being communicated in silos. So there was this great need, Rosalie thought, to create an online forum that would bring some of these practices together into a common conversation. And basically the way in which I formulated it with my colleagues went from kind of being a platform in the beginning to much more of a traditional publication model, where every week we would publish a new idea that was a good idea for the future of cities worldwide that just so happened to be tried and tested right here in New York City. And that very much was the spirit in which it continues to this day. We would really, Brian, reach out to people who were doing interesting work, in some cases very local work, in some cases very global work, but that was rooted in a particular place and cross-disciplinary lines and was in some way oriented towards redressing issues of social justice. And what I realized kind of late in the game, several years into this, is that what I had on my hands was a really remarkable oral history almost, an archive of the new coalitions and trends in urban practice that have been emerging since the financial crash, and that because I had this incredible data set on my hands, it was incumbent upon me to do something with it, which is when I started talking to Alan and made this book. The other big sort of influence on my own perspective in doing this is I was originally trained as a filmmaker, as Molly mentioned in my bio, and so I come from a tradition with a whole different set of heroes than my sort of urban canon heroes like Patrick Geddes or Lewis Mumford to a lesser extent. But I think the reason that this informed the way in which I sort of guided the magazine and then informed very much how I organized the book was the sensibility that those of us who tell stories about cities, that in itself is a form of city making, the way in which we interpret, and this is of course super relevant to those of you in this program who are studying design writing, that the interpretation of urban phenomena and urban change feeds back into the ways in which we intervene. So one of the things of Urban Omnibus of which I am most proud is this contention that the interventions in the built environment and the interpretations of the built environment cannot be necessarily studied or characterized as distinct, and the mutual influence of those two forms of practice must be studied together. And this very much comes from my own tradition and training as a documentary filmmaker who primarily works on museum installations, such as some of those flashing before you. Which brings us to the book. So I had this oral history, if you will. It was by no means a scientific data set, right? I had a very sort of editorial, curatorial sensibility in curating the sample of stories that I would tell each week. One time it would be in the, an engineer, the next week maybe a public artist who works on mural projects, the next week an architect with a traditional architecture project that was somehow in the public service, then I sort of looked at all of them and really tried to identify some key emergent themes that really could help tell a story about what was shifting in urban practice and how we talk about and how we make cities since I started doing this at the beginning of the financial crash. And what I ended up with were four sort of big buckets of practice, which are very traditional categories of urbanism. So there's a chapter on public space, a chapter on infrastructure, a chapter on information technology, and a chapter on housing. Of course, there are major elements of urbanism that are completely outside the scope of this particular work. Transportation, I think, is probably the most obvious. And there are a lot of other aspects of, education, criminal justice, aspects of what makes a city work that were outside the scope of this work. But really looking at what I had on my hands as far as this archive of stories of urban innovation, these were the things that really stood out as categories that were very traditional, but that needed to be rethought in a particular way as the practices I'd been reporting on sort of made clear. And another way in which I wanted to kind of refresh or reinvigorate those categories was something that I think all of us who care a lot about cities, and I think Lewis Mumford would probably agree with this, we tend to share, certain vague ideas about what our values are. Of course, we disagree about the proper role of the market or the proper role of government, but in general, we have some buzzwords that are pretty vague and squishy, like we think things should be resilient and we think things should be diverse. But I really sort of saw, looking at this sort of treasure trove of urban practice, a real need to assert and identify the ethical imperatives that I think were really embedded in all of these types of practice, and to really draw those out and articulate them clearly. And so the book is kind of organized as a little bit of a narrativized manifesto, if you will, of these ethical imperatives for each of these categories of urban practice. Starting with the public space chapter, incorporate long-term use and maintenance along with the practice of citizenship into any discussion of public space design and delivery. What I mean by this is what I was talking about at the beginning, that we need to, I think, move past assuming that landscapes and public space and open space is something that is delivered to the public as a complete environment, but rather is a practice, is a process, involves sort of long-term maintenance and stewardship, such as in the case of this example, which I briefly mentioned earlier, Corona Plaza in Queens, which I found to be a really sort of emblematic example of what can happen when informal groups of people get together. This started out as a group of local business owners, as reported by Caitlin Blanchfield in the brilliantly reported article for Urban Omnibus about this process. Business owners sort of stringing up Christmas lights and kind of taking this disused and poorly used, essentially tangle of traffic infrastructure and turning it into an informal public space. But then what happened after that was through a bunch of sort of ingenuity and continued and sustained effort, attracting the attention of the Queens Museum, which became a very important partner in this work, eventually getting a grant from the Department of Transportation to demap the street and create bollards and give a small grant for bollards and planters and things that actually enabled it to become a very needed form of public space that was not necessarily being provided by the nearby Flushing Meadows Corona Park, which is a very sort of formal place, great for picnics, great for ball fields, but not necessarily for the types of cultural organizing that this neighborhood, which is, in terms of nativity, one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world, really needed, which was a venue for classes on immigration rights, on housing training, on cultural festivals, on food festivals, that was really able to grow up organically, but importantly, in coalition with key institutional actors who had the vision to see the potential of this space and help make it come into being. Similar thing goes for urban agriculture in East New York, which was the very first story we ever reported on Urban Omnibus, and is the very first story in the beginning of the first sort of body chapter of the book. But it's not just exclusively these very worthy social justice oriented public space projects that I wanted to bring into this conversation. I also really, there's a huge trend in a lot of low fidelity, DIY, ad hoc, fun, playful, and mirthful attempts at creating public space that I thought was equally important to celebrate and lift up. This is a bunch of young architect dudes who got together on a weekend and started putting up these very easy to assemble, brightly colored birdhouses along the Gowanus Canal. And what for them was sort of an attempt to assume or to remind the community that this incredibly putrid and toxic waterway was itself a habitat, was in fact a place where there was animal life. That was their key goal, and to build something together and do some fun stuff on a weekend, actually came to mean much more. It actually allowed the local nonprofit community to have an organizing tool that enabled them to recruit a different core of volunteers to help with cleanup days and street tree plantings and a whole bunch of other things because of the seminal sort of signal that these birdhouses shifted. And so what started out as something fun ended up having a much more impactful relationship on the neighborhood. The infrastructure imperative is to reconceive infrastructure as a multifunction public good and a constituent element of landscape. And I'm talking about hard infrastructures here. This is the Verrazano Bridge, but also much softer infrastructures as well. And one of the really wonderful things, and this is again where sort of Mumford comes in sort of attempting to resonate with or synergize a whole canon of urban theory and urban history, is the idea that we used to, you start to learn when you're looking at these things over and over again that these stories of innovation, if you look back far enough, everything's been innovative before, and there's nothing quite as new as we tend to think it is. This is an image of the approach to the Manhattan Bridge from what is now Manhattan Chinatown. And you can be forgiven for not recognizing what is now a tangle of infrastructure as something that was once originally designed to be a quite grand public space. There was a time when we thought in this country of infrastructure and public space as coordinated elements of a cohesive system. and infrastructure could be a guiding, developing force that could come in advance of development and help to sort of guide that in appropriate ways. But we've really seen over the last 50, 60 years in particular, what to my mind comes up to be a too tight intertwining of form and function, what we expect from infrastructure, which has led to an increased brittleness in this country, failing infrastructural systems. And on both neither the right nor the left do we have any visionary arguments for the sustained function of infrastructure. So I really had a really great time learning whole new fields, economics and ecology, and a whole bunch of other readings of the downstream benefits on the demand side of infrastructural systems, and then was able to bring that intellectual history into dialogue with projects like this. This is emblematic of the Staten Island Blue Belt, which is one of my favorite projects in the entire book, because this gets back to what I was talking about at the beginning in terms of public service. This is a project the same people have been working on at the Department of City Planning and the Department of Environmental Protection for over 30 years. An incredibly thankless, detailed, and minute task. Their office, by the way, at DEP is in Elmhurst, Queens, in these like windowless rooms, trying to arrange and negotiate this incredibly fine-grained series of real estate deals in order to create enough land to, in public hands, to re-engineer a wetland stream system that could mitigate the intense sewage overflow issues in Staten Island. Staten Island, after this bridge was built in 1964, exploded its development, and this sort of format of development, by the way, when I give this talk in other countries and other cities, they're baffled that this is New York City at all. This is, of course, not the development patterns that people assume New York to have, but this suburban landscape of single-family homes developed in many cases, in almost all cases, in advance of any coordinated attempt at creating a sewage infrastructure system. So when it rains, water rushes off rooftops and roadways, bringing pollutants directly into the harbor. So the Staten Island Blue Belt is an attempt to re-engineer a wetland stream system that can slow the drainage of that water. And it's incredibly huge in scale, yet is unbelievably unsexy, right? I mean, it's a bunch of small-scale real estate deals to make a stream. But this was very emblematic to me of the kind of visionary, long-term, sustained, iterative public process and public service that I really wanted to lift up alongside some of the design projects. And again, you know, none of this is possible without the interpretation side as well. So on the other end of the spectrum, I told the story of this guy, Steve Duncan, who's a sewer diver, who you know, started out as a punk who just liked sort of crawling into places that he wasn't supposed to be, and turned that into a career as a really sort of passionate student and observer of our sewage infrastructure. And his contention, which I'm very much in line with, is that in order to advocate for creative or visionary investment in these infrastructural systems on which we all rely, we need to make them legible, and in his case, beautiful. He takes these long, sumptuous, long exposure photographs of, this is a self-portrait actually, though they're not all self-portraits, of the underwater sewage system, this is in Manhattan, in order to argue for encouraging greater intimacy with the choices that have led to these infrastructural systems, these legacy systems that we are forced to contend with, as an argument for advocating for their maintenance and continued investment. There are two more chapters, but I think I'll leave you with just one. I'll just tell you a little bit about the technology chapter, and I'll save housing for part two. The information technology chapter, which I think some of you may have read, the imperative there is to think inductively, to complement measurement with close observation, to embrace technologies that support rather than disrupt democratic governance. Because I think too often when we think about sort of the technological promise of this moment of big data, we're thinking too much about what is possible and much less on the ethical dimensions of what is desirable. This is an advertisement for the development in Hudson Yards, which will be one of the most instrumented and computerized living environments, you know, yet in this country. And of course, there are real benefits to the efficiency dividend of what computerized systems and ubiquitous computing can provide. I'm not opposed to that en masse, but it needs to be complemented, urgently needs to be complemented with real life human observation. I mean, the Fitbit example of the the army bases, as a digression, if anyone read that story, is a perfect example of what can go wrong when you don't complement measurement with human observation and inductive logic. But I also really wanted to hold up some optimistic stories of what a new way of thinking about technology can really provide. This example is from Red Hook Wi-Fi, which was a really sort of inspiring project that came about or intensified in many ways right after Superstorm Sandy, which devastated the neighborhood of Red Hook. I actually have a quote from Lewis Mumford in the book when I'm describing sort of walking to Red Hook, which has sort of the highest concentration of public housing anywhere in New York, and the statistics of those public housing environments do not compare favorably with the rest of the public housing in New York. So physically cut off by the Gowanus Expressway from any kind of services, infrastructure, subway, et cetera. So this enormous development, the Red Hook houses, the first part of it was completed in 1939, the same year that Robert Moses started construction on the Gowanus Parkway, which is the part of the BQE that cuts off Red Hook from the rest of Brooklyn. And in a 1959 issue of The New Yorker, Lewis Mumford noted the irony of tearing down elevated railways only to replace them with highways, which he called, quote, the same nuisance in an even noisier and more insistent form. But what is Brooklyn to the highway engineer, except a place to go through rapidly at whatever necessary sacrifice of peace and amenity by its inhabitants? Thank you, Lewis Mumford. What I loved about this project was the same sort of disregard that Mumford is sort of casually mentioning in his New Yorker column is something that was really laid painfully and tragically bare after Superstorm Sandy and the devastation that it wrought on this neighborhood. And one of the very obvious things that happened is the neighborhood realized that they were completely dependent on just one internet service provider. And so they created their own community-owned wireless network that had a tremendous amount of locally specific applications. There was an app on the home screen of the community-owned Wi-Fi splash page that tracked the one bus that takes you from the center of the neighborhood over a mile to the nearest subway station. There was another one that tracked stop and frisks in the neighborhood. But one of the things that I think is the most promising in terms of new ways of thinking about information technology is the way in which the project used this as a workforce and youth development strategy to actually distribute the technological know-how to create these systems to young people who are increasingly going to be expected to have this knowledge, but it's not being taught in schools. And so that I thought was a much richer way of thinking about the distribution effects of technology than just turning everybody into an input, which has a veneer of democratic participation, but in fact is anything but. It's consolidating control of our decisions into fewer and fewer hands. So I'll just end with one of the many theorists that I was able to reinvest in through this work and contextualizing each of these contemporary practices with the way it maps onto a long intellectual history of thinking about cities. Patrick Geddes, who's a hero of mine, he is often, I think, over-associated with Lewis Mumford because of he was such a big influence on Mumford and encouraged him in his writing. And Lewis Mumford was an exceptionally talented writer. Patrick Geddes was not an exceptionally talented writer. His work is actually kind of hard to understand and not particularly beautiful or evocative in the way that Mumford's language, particularly the culture of cities, is just beautifully written. So much so that I think the inherent conservatism and eventual retrenchment from cities that Mumford turned to in the end of his career is almost hard to see because he has such a deep knowledge and learning about the history of urban development. But Mumford, by 1939, thought that New York City was at capacity and that everybody should move to Amenia, New York, or to the garden cities of Ebenezer Howard, who also was very influenced by Geddes, took an even more extreme utopian view of, okay, everything has to be 33,000 people, you'll have industry here, and while none of Ebenezer Howard's garden cities worked out exactly the way that he thought they would, they very much influenced an entire generation, more than one generation, of city planners in thinking about the discrete elements of what should be located where within a common place. Patrick Geddes, who very much is a part of this lineage, coming a little earlier, didn't really buy any of that. His big maxim was what he called conservative surgery, which was to be as specific and targeted as possible in what you remove and how you intervene in conditions of poverty or congestion or poor sanitation. And he walked the walk. He and his wife lived in the squalid neighborhood of James Court in Edinburgh and worked with their neighbors to identify what were the structures that were blocking light, what were the places where you could have shared sanitary facilities, and really sort of invented the community-based bottom-up plan that then he scaled up to the regional survey, which is what he's most famous for. Even years later, when he and his wife, who was a true partner to him in this work, were designing colonial plans. He did the plan for Tel Aviv. He planned almost 20 cities in India. He did actually, interestingly, the very first refugee resettlement plan, which was in Cyprus for Armenians fleeing pogroms in the Ottoman Empire. But he came at this from a perspective of deep observation, being the grounding purpose. He, like Jane Jacobs decades later, was really believed in proceeding from the particulars to the general, and he deeply believed in doing so from a position of observation and then representation. This is an image of his Outlook Tower, which I hold up in the book as kind of a foil to the black boxes of what technology is increasingly creating, where he had this, he arranged this museum as an index on the universe to try and explain to people in these different scales. He had a room on Edinburgh, a room on Scotland, a room on Europe, a room on the world, where you could really see in scale models and through these artfully exhibited displays the effect of things like topography or language or demographics on urban development. He deeply believed that to be able to do anything and to be able to have any sense of capacity or power to change the urban environments in which you lived, you had to be able to observe it and represent it. I'll just end with a passage from him, and then we can move to some questions. This inductive approach to urban planning, greatly informed by the scientific method he'd learned and practiced as a biologist — he was a biologist before he turned his attention to cities and regions — sets Geddes apart from many of his peers and successors in the incipient town planning movement, which was primarily populated by engineers and architects with little love for existing urban conditions, let alone citizen involvement. While his peers respected classical formalism in architecture, they were more inclined to advance wholly new models for urban fabric than to improve upon extant ones. Geddes' work anticipates and offers lessons to current quandaries about regionalism, systemic thinking, and civic participation. Of particular interest to me is his concept of the Outlook Tower, a kind of civic education organization that he hoped every city would institute. Greater popular understanding of the processes of urban development, Geddes believed, would lead to greater participation. Today, the touted potential of information technology is to transform our understanding and planning of cities relies largely on the notion that informatics enables everyone to be an input. You can be an active input, like the occasional cyclist who votes online for where to place a bike share station, or a passive input, like the driver whose smartphone operates as one of a horde of traffic congestion monitors. Yet just like the algorithms Google Maps and other digital platforms use to measure and deliver real-time traffic data, these technological possibilities most often obscure rather than illuminate urban decision-making. The idea of crowdsourcing may sound democratic, but its technological infrastructure is opaque. We need fewer black boxes and more Outlook towers. The final chapter, which I'm not going to talk about, is about housing, and particularly about how to reconfigure existing housing to meet shifting demographic needs. And I tell a lot of really interesting stories. This is another thinker that you could have a whole series of symposia on, Henry George. This gets really nerdy into tax theory, which I'm happy to talk about over a glass of wine, but I will spare you today. But the basic, to end, what I end with in the conclusion is really what I think all of these stories lead up to. Even though these are incredibly local practices dealing with incredibly local concerns, What it adds up to, in my view, really gets at the inextricability of what I see as the three existential crises of our time. The first two are obvious: climate change and income inequality. The third, I think, is less so, which is the crisis of trust between citizens and government. And one of the ways I think that all these practices can build up together towards an ethic of city making, which is an ethic of co-presence, of coalition building, of interdisciplinary thinking around problem solving in the public realm, is really to try and find ways to activate cities' inherent capacity to be infrastructures of solidarity. We know that cities reproduce and intensify very serious inequalities, but we also know that anytime, I mean, in my experience, speaking personally, anytime I get on the subway or walk down any city street in New York, the dizzying, dazzling diversity of people's life experiences that are so different from my own, even if we're not necessarily interacting, can't help but force a certain kind of empathy, which is something, of course, this world needs a lot more of in this particular moment. And I think there is a lesson to be learned in really looking and celebrating and lifting up these voices of people who are dedicating their professional lives or their volunteer hours to making their neighborhoods just a little bit more resilient, more inclusive, more stimulating, more beautiful, and more just, that can help us perhaps come up with some action plans for dealing with these existential threats. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassim. So I have a Mumford-esque kind of question to kick off with. I was reading a piece that Brendan Gill had written in The New Yorker in 1990, which was a couple of months after Mumford's death. And he was talking about how some of actually a kind of series of skyline columns that Mumford had written around the time of the building of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which is a Robert Moses special, could almost be taken together as sort of a civil defense manual, and just in terms of how they were trying to urge the reader to be outraged about what was happening. And you described your own work as a manifesto of sorts, and so I just wanted to ask you to talk more about the audience, or maybe potential audiences, sure, for your work, because I mean it was so exciting to hear about the stories in Red Hook where the younger kids were coming together and doing these like proactive things with disseminating their own Wi-Fi systems. So architects and urban planners and even if you go a couple of degrees of separation beyond your own field, tend to have conversations amongst themselves. And I feel like your book can be having conversations that ripple out much farther. So just wondered about your intended audience.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, my intended audience is, I mean, there's an inner layer and an outer layer, I think. Obviously, of course, the inner core is the kinds of people that I am, not necessarily the kinds of people that I'm writing about, but the kinds of people who have the potential to be the people that I'm writing about, in order to create a sense of transformative possibility, enable people's own inherent capacities to look outside and see what's happening in their neighborhoods and try and get involved. But there's a bigger, broader audience that I also want to hopefully reach with this work, which is basically anybody who thinks cities are cool. The half ironic opening line of the book is cities are huge right now, and the thinking behind that is that we have now seen an explosion of interest in cities, which is now starting to ebb. Millennials are starting to leave again. But 20 years now of intense interest in cities, which of course has led to real pressures on urban development because young people with means are moving into neighborhoods, and there's gentrification pressures and other real estate pressures and displacement eventually, but that has led to, or that is symptomatic rather of an intense interest in cities and a desire to be in these stimulating environments where there's a diversity of experience. But for the majority of people who think cities are cool, the way in which that's expressed is through like consumption, right? Restaurants and bars and art to see and things to buy. But I think there's an inherent potential there to turn that desire for the diversity of experiences that cities can provide, the cities inherently do provide, into a greater sense of communitarian responsibility about how that diversity of experiences came to be, which is through the diversity of its people, right? So I think that there is an intended audience here to try and activate or spark a little bit of a desire among people who are perhaps armchair urbanists. You know, they maybe aren't involved in volunteering to plant a street tree down the block, but really get into passionate, heated conversations in the bar about the Starbucks coming in or whatever it might be. How can you turn that interest in your neighborhood and neighborhood change and your desire for the diversity of experiences that cities and neighborhoods provide into a sense of communitarian responsibility, into a sense of enabling a transformative possibility that you can activate that agency and get people to become more involved in particular ways?
Let's take some audience questions. Okay, I'm gonna.
I guess without a microphone. So if you were
Can you wait for the mic just for the recording?
It's for the video, so people, posterity.
Could you imagine any public policies that would help advance your 4 goals?
Yes. Well, I think the easiest one and the lowest hanging fruit is to really try and look critically at the difference between expense and capital. I think the ways in which we think of, so for example, participatory budgeting, which in many ways I think signifies a positive move towards greater involvement, greater democratization of decision making, but that's only for capital funds, right? That's only for bricks and mortar. It's not for expense at all. You can't ever pay a salary through something that's participatorily budgeted. You can't ever sort of pay for upkeep in the same way. That's a very small example, but I think that one of the themes that runs through each of these imperatives is a need to focus on the sense of time. And I think architects are particularly bad at thinking about time, because the way in which, and this is a design criticism question as well, the way in which we talk about the built environment is oftentimes on opening day, right? You cut a ribbon on a formally beautiful, perhaps even responsive to local social concerns, and then immediately it starts to deteriorate. And the attention paid to the quality and assessing the quality of that built environment is about its pre-occupancy design. And so there's, I think, not necessarily a public policy thing, but it's incumbent upon those of us who tell stories about cities, I'm speaking to the students in the room, to not just tell stories about buildings on opening day, to not just tell stories about parks on opening day, to not just tell stories about urban process in terms of what is exclusively new, but to really try and find the drama and the storytelling capacity in how something is taken care of over time, and to activate design to actually feel like it is responsible for some of these post-occupancy questions. So the idea of time, the idea of sort of iterative, longitudinal thinking is something that I think needs to be worked into design pedagogy. I think it needs to be worked into political, sort of how we teach civics and political participation. And I think it also has to do with the money. So are we only focusing all of our bond initiatives on money to pay for something to be built, designed, built, and constructed, and leaving, a landscape, as you know better than anyone, it's far more expensive to maintain, in the long term than it is to design and build. But
The nice thing about that is that it does deal with work. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what we need. We all need work, and we need meaningful work. And so if you were engaged in gardens and landscape and caring for things, then you would have work. And
absolutely.
Other questions?
I have one question. I've been a resident of Tribeca all my life. I'd like to ask why the east side of our city is not being developed like what our west side's going on. Can you answer me that question? It's just
Nope.
unbelievable. Well, I have to.
I mean, there's so many different ways to answer that. The nuances and quirks and whimsy of development patterns is a little bit beyond my scope, because the factors are so particular. I mean, there was a really interesting article today about one of the residents of the Seward Park urban renewal area who went back to his home 40 years, or not back to his home, back to the apartment promised to him when he was kicked out in 1967. And it has been surface parking lots because of the entrenched political battles between different groups of all of whom wanted affordable homes, but the intricacies of that political process led to 40 years of what was the largest city-owned lot south of 96th Street being surface parking for 40 years. So, I mean, that's just one example. I think the specificities of the political process, the local political process that lead to developers finding value and who owns what. I mean, the thing that people forget to ask all the time is who owns the land. So in places where there's consolidated ownership, development is a lot easier than in places where it's, scattered
Do
site.
you think Trinity Church has a lot to do with what's going on in terms of the time that they've been there and they've established so much of the land?
I mean, I think that there's and this is something I always tell my students, look at who owns the land.
Right.
I don't know specifically to answer that question, but there are huge institutions that own the Archdiocese, NYU, Columbia, the city, the state. The state owns a lot more land in the city than we think, and the city can't access it. So thinking about those questions is important to understanding development patterns for sure.
Thank you. Could you comment on the trend of the propensity of city officials to turn over vast amounts of public land to private developers in the guise of providing amenities, whether it be the pier, the amusement pier that they're going to do out, that Barry whatever was going to do and Diane were going to do out in the Hudson, or the art industrial complex commandeering vast swatches of public parks to put up multi-corporate art.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. We used to have in this country something called government, and now we have governance, right? Which is very much, I think, speaks to the desire of local public officials to incentivize the market to provide the public goods that government used to provide. Now, there are very good reasons why that's the case. They can do so more efficiently. They can do so more quickly. They can do so, with cutting through a lot of the, red tape, bureaucracy, regulation, labor things that was slowing down the provision of public goods by the public sector. But the incentivization and the market-based schemes to provide public goods are inherently undemocratic because they oftentimes rely on the largesse of neighbors with means contributing to conservancy models of upkeep fees, et cetera, et cetera. So it is by no means while it may be more efficient, it is more efficient at the cost of distributing equitably those public goods. But this has been equally an issue on both the left and the right. I mean, there are very specific, New York-specific, there's a New York-specific history of the disposition of publicly owned land that has a lot to do with the financial crisis in the 70s and the way in which so much housing through in-rem foreclosure came into city ownership, and the city found itself in the very uncomfortable and unplanned position of being an ill-equipped slumlord for huge swaths of the city. And the ways in which that land was disposed to the private market in many ways to provide affordable housing, but in other ways, it definitely led to what happened when everything converted into a co-op and a lot of people got a huge windfall. There are other things like that. I mean, the East New York Farms example is a really interesting story of these were city-owned lots for the most part that had been homes that were either burned down by rapacious predatory landlords or left to be neglected so long that they eventually came down or were torn down because they were unsafe. So they were technically city-owned land, and people started farming on them. In East New York, at the time I was writing about East New York in 2009, over 50% of the fresh produce consumed in East New York was grown in East New York, which on the one hand is an incredibly optimistic story about the local ingenuity and entrepreneurship of these farmers. On the other hand, it's an incredibly depressing story about food deserts and the provision of fresh food through supermarkets. It has a lot to do with the racism inherent to lending practices, supermarkets putting out loans. I mean, there's a long list of reasons. But where it relates to the private provision of public goods, which was the essence of your question, was these were then considered, now East New York is a booming real estate market. And so there's incredible pressure to build multifamily housing on some of these sites, which was inconceivable, even 10 years ago. And the way in which that community got together and organized with some institutional coalition partners to convince the city and the state that these were not temporary uses, because you look at a map, it looks like it's vacant and it's city-owned. Of course, why can't we just sell that to a developer, get some cash, and incentivize the developer to provide affordable housing? But the way in which they were able to convince them that these were not temporary uses and were in fact not only necessary for food provision, but also for youth development programs, also for the amount of kids who were going after school to farm instead of hanging out on the street corner or whatever they might have been doing. And the way that argument was made, I think, is something that a lot of neighborhoods have a lot to learn from in terms of making a case for a variety of different kinds of uses that gets to the livability piece. Anyway, I've digressed from Barry Diller's pier, but yeah, I think we have a lot of really hard questions to ask about how much we try to use government to incentivize the market to provide the public goods that government used to provide.
So yeah, I found this a really interesting talk, and I think the Citymaker is kind of like the city making is kind of a placeholder for so much of what I do love about cities. Like, they are collective, creative projects that's like everyday life environments. And so like the idea of the Citymaker is like, we're actively creating this together. That's like my inspiration in a lot of ways. At the same time, like, the ultimate paradox of the city is that it is a collective project that's socially produced, and yet that's not, the city is also the center of like extraction and capitalism and privatized value that is extracting that collectively produced value into private hands. So in terms of thinking about like city making as a book and like an aspirational view and all these positives, do you have a way of conceptualizing kind of this like city taking, like speculation and privatization and gentrification that is kind of extracting this collectively produced vision? Yeah. I would just love to like a second book or like other things. Yeah. Is it part of the story that you're telling, or is it like, does it need to be told to, maybe it's a different audience, but like, how is that story being told too?
Well, it's kind of related to my answer about the who owns the land. I would encourage everybody to read Henry George. Henry George was a tax theorist who came up with the sort of land value taxation thing, which as I said, is very complicated, and I'm not going to get into its specifics right now, but this really sums it up. I mean, even Winston Churchill said, the landlord contributes nothing to society. He just waits to reap the benefits of the society, of the benefits and the value that is, as you say, socially and collectively produced. I mean, this guy paid $3,600 for this lot, will hold it till he gets $6,000. The profit is unearned increment made possible by the presence of this community and the enterprise of its people. I take the profit without earning it. For the remedy, read Henry George. This guy was so popular. I mean, this is a postcard. This became a postcard that was then collected in a book of postcards, all of which were postcards about people putting up signs in their yard to tell people to read the book of Henry George. After Lincoln, his funeral was attended by hundreds of thousands of people. His book was the second most best-selling book in the 1890s after the Bible. And entire utopian communities came up out of this, which were really all about this idea that what are some and he was not a Marxist by any means. He really believed in private enterprise. He really believed in sort of a marketplace for ingenuity and innovation and collaboration. But he wanted to figure out ways to decouple the enterprise, which is what happens on top of the land, from the ownership of the land itself. And I think that there are a lot of ideas that are now sort of, people are trying to scale up to deal with the affordability crisis around housing in particular in very expensive cities like New York and London and San Francisco, that emerged from this. One of the most direct descendants, it also has a lot of other antecedents, one of the most direct descendants of this is the Community Land Trust, which is another way of operationalizing the decoupling of land from property, and creating a sort of a nonprofit corporation that owns the land in perpetuity, and then you can sell the properties at market value however you want. You know, another thing that does this in a slightly different way is the limited equity co-ops, the Mitchell-Lama system, which we all had all that property assembled. It was an enormous effort, and then we watched it walk out the door as soon as the market conditions were right for some people to profit. So there's a lot there and I don't think we figured it out. Community land trusts aren't scalable in the way, because they require, you know, a commonality and a solidarity of purpose among people who all move in at the same time, which is pretty hard to maintain with generational differences and, you know, demographic changes and a whole bunch of other things. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but people have been thinking about this for a very long time, and we would do well to look backwards, which I think Mumford would agree with, in order to look for some of the solutions to that consolidation of the consolidation in fewer and fewer hands, the control over and the profiting from the creative capacity of the collectivity of the city.
One more question. You question Mr. Lama? Why do you make that up? There is no more.
That's what I just said. I mean, it still exists. There are still many Mitchell things still in the Mitchell-Lama program. Yeah, absolutely. Across the street from where I live, there's an active Mitchell-Lama on Lafayette Avenue in Clinton Hill. But after 50 years, they have, in many cases, the ability to go private, and many of them have.
Okay. Well,